World War II left behind more than just battle scars. Some of the sites where soldiers fought, died, and sacrificed everything are now said to be haunted by restless spirits. Here are the top 5 most haunted World War II battlefields where the echoes of the past still linger. Story 1: Ghosts of the Bloody Beachhead, Anzio Beach, Italy. Anzio Beach, a quiet coastal area in Italy, saw one of the most pivotal amphibious assaults of World War II. On January 22, 1944, the Allied forces launched Operation Shingle, a plan to establish a beachhead and break through the German defenses to advance toward Rome. The Allies, composed of American and British troops, expected a swift victory, but instead found themselves embroiled in a brutal and prolonged battle. The German counterattacks were relentless, and for months, the beach became a death trap for soldiers, with tens of thousands falling in the sand and bloodied surf. The battlefields of Anzio today are serene, with the Mediterranean waves lapping quietly at the shore. Tourists stroll along the beach, unaware of the horrors that unfolded decades before. But there are some who know the land's secrets, locals who've heard whispers of the past, and tourists who leave with stories of encounters they can't explain. The ghosts of Anzio, they say, are not at rest. Marco Rossi had lived in Anzio his entire life. His family's house overlooked the beach, and as a child, he would often play in the sand, completely unaware of the battle that had once raged there. His grandparents told stories of the invasion, how the Germans shelled the beach relentlessly, how the bodies of soldiers washed ashore for days after each attack. Marco grew up with these stories, but never believed them to be more than family tales. But one summer, something changed. It started when he took a group of tourists out on his fishing boat for an evening tour. The sun had just set, and a thick mist began to roll in from the sea. The boat was only a mile from the shore when one of the tourists, an older British man, grew uneasy. "Do you hear that?" the man asked, looking out toward the water. Marco listened but heard nothing beyond the gentle slap of the waves. "What do you mean?" he asked, slightly irritated. "Voices," the man replied, his eyes wide. "Men shouting. It sounds like they're in the water." The other tourists grew nervous, their eyes scanning the misty horizon. Marco strained his ears, and after a few moments he heard it too. Faint at first, barely perceptible, a distant echo of men's voices calling out in panic. The cries rose and fell with the waves, becoming louder and more distinct. "They're drowning," one of the women on the boat whispered. "They're calling for help." Marco felt a chill run down his spine. There were no boats in the area, no one swimming this far out at night. Yet, the voices continued, growing more desperate. He quickly steered the boat back to shore, his heart racing as the cries followed them across the water. By the time they docked, the sounds had faded, but the tourists were shaken, and Marco couldn't shake the feeling that they had encountered something from beyond the grave. Marco's encounter with the strange voices was only the beginning. Over the next few weeks, more tourists began reporting eerie experiences along Anzio Beach. Some claimed to hear the distant boom of artillery fire in the dead of night, while others spoke of shadowy figures moving through the mist, their forms flickering like ghosts as they walked along the water's edge. One evening, as Marco walked alone along the beach, he saw something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The sun had just set, casting an orange glow across the horizon, and a thin layer of fog was rolling in from the sea. The beach was empty, save for the occasional sound of the waves lapping against the shore. Marco was about to turn back when he noticed movement out of the corner of his eye. At first, it was just a flicker, a dark shape that seemed to appear and disappear in the fog. Marco froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He strained his eyes, trying to make out the figure in the distance. It was a man, dressed in what appeared to be a soldier's uniform, walking slowly along the shoreline. The man's posture was rigid, and his movements were slow, almost mechanical. Marco's breath caught in his throat. There were no military exercises in the area, and no one had worn uniforms like that in decades. He took a cautious step forward, his eyes fixed on the figure. But as he did, the man vanished into the mist, leaving only the sound of the waves behind. Shaken, Marco hurried back to his house, his mind racing. The figure he had seen was not of this world, it couldn't have been. Over the next few nights, he began to see more of them, shadowy figures, some walking along the beach, others standing still, their faces obscured by the fog. They were soldiers, dressed in the uniforms of the Allied and German forces that had fought at Anzio, their spirits trapped in an eternal limbo. One evening, as Marco sat on his porch, staring out at the beach, an old man approached him. His name was Arthur Jameson, and he had fought at Anzio during the war. He had returned to Italy to pay his respects to his fallen comrades, but he had been hearing rumors about the beach being haunted. Arthur had seen his share of death during the war, but he didn't believe in ghosts. Not until now. Arthur told Marco that he had been visiting the American cemetery just outside Anzio when he heard a voice calling his name. At first, he thought it was his imagination, an old man's mind, playing tricks on him. But then the voice came again, louder this time, unmistakable. Jameson. Arthur turned, his heart racing, and saw a figure standing by the edge of the cemetery. The man was young, dressed in a tattered American uniform, his face pale and gaunt. Arthur recognized him immediately. It was Corporal Peter Wallace, a soldier from his unit who had died during the battle. "I thought I was losing my mind," Arthur said, his voice trembling. But he was real. He was there. He looked at me, and then he was gone. Marco listened in silence, the weight of Arthur's words settling over him like a heavy fog. He had seen the ghosts too, and now he knew they were real. The spirits of the soldiers who had fought and died at Anzio were still there, trapped in the place where they had lost their lives. As more stories of ghostly encounters spread through the town, the beach became a place of both fear and fascination. Some locals refused to go near the water at night, while others, curious thrill-seekers, ventured to the shoreline in search of the apparitions. But the spirits of Anzio were not to be trifled with. One night, a group of tourists decided to camp on the beach, hoping to catch a glimpse of the legendary ghosts. They set up tents near the water's edge and settled in for the night, laughing and sharing stories around a small fire. But as the hours passed and the fog began to roll in, the mood shifted. The wind picked up, carrying with it the faint sound of distant voices, men shouting, calling out orders, the unmistakable sounds of battle. The tourists fell silent, their laughter dying in their throats as the sounds grew louder. The fog thickened, and through the swirling mist, they saw them shadowy figures emerging from the water, their forms flickering in and out of view. The soldiers moved slowly, their heads down, their expressions solemn. Some carried rifles slung over their shoulders, while others stumbled, as if wounded. The tourists watched in horror as the ghostly soldiers marched past them, their eyes empty, their faces pale. One of the tourists, a young woman, stood up, her eyes wide with fear. "We need to leave," she whispered, but it was too late. The soldiers were all around them, their cold presence sending shivers down their spines. The ghosts moved silently through the camp, their expressions distant, as if they didn't see the living among them. And then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, they were gone, disappearing into the mist, leaving the tourists shaken and terrified. Marco had always been fascinated by the stories of ghosts and spirits, but after his experiences at Anzio Beach, he knew that there was something more to them than just superstition. The soldiers who had fought and died there were not at peace, their spirits trapped in an endless cycle of battle, unable to move on. One night, as Marco stood on the beach, staring out at the horizon, he saw something that would change him forever. The fog was thick that night, the air heavy with the scent of salt and decay. Marco could barely see more than a few feet in front of him, but he knew he wasn't alone. He could feel the presence of the soldiers, their cold energy pressing down on him like a weight. And then, through the mist, he saw them. Hundreds of soldiers, marching in formation along the beach. Their faces were gaunt, their eyes empty, their uniforms tattered and stained with blood. They moved silently, their heads down as if they were still locked in battle. But at the front of the line, Marco saw a familiar face, Corporal Peter Wallace, the same ghost that Arthur Jameson had seen. Wallace's eyes locked onto Marco's, and for a moment the two stared at each other, the air between them heavy with the weight of history. And then, just as suddenly, the vision faded, the soldiers disappearing into the fog, leaving Marco alone on the beach. Marco knew that the ghosts of Anzio Beach would never rest. The soldiers who had fought and died there were forever bound to the land, their spirits trapped in the fog, unable to move on. The beach had become a place of memory and mourning, a battlefield frozen in time. Visitors to Anzio today still report strange occurrences, ghostly figures walking along the shore, the distant sounds of gunfire and explosions, the cries of soldiers lost in the waves. The battle may have ended long ago, but the echoes of war remain, a haunting reminder of the lives lost on that blood-soaked beach. For Marco, Anzio Beach would never be the same. The ghosts of the past had revealed themselves to him, and he knew that the spirits of the soldiers would always be there, watching, waiting, trapped in an eternal limbo. The bloody beachhead of Anzio had become a haunted place, a battlefield where the past refused to die. Anzio Beach is more than just a historical landmark. It's a place where the past and present collide, where the spirits of the dead still linger, trapped in the fog of war. The ghosts of the soldiers who fought and died there continue to haunt the shoreline, their restless souls unable to find peace. For those brave enough to visit Anzio at night, the echoes of battle are never far away. The sounds of gunfire, the cries of the wounded, and the ghostly figures of soldiers marching through the mist are all reminders that the horrors of war leave a mark not only on the living, but on the dead as well. Story 2, Napoleon's resting place turned haunted to command post. The Château de Malmaison, once the opulent home of Napoleon Bonaparte and his wife, Josephine, stood as a symbol of the emperor's power and ambition. Nestled in the rolling hills outside Paris, the chateau had seen moments of great history, from secret political meetings to grand parties held for foreign dignitaries. After Napoleon's fall from power, the chateau became a place of memory, where the French leader spent his final days before being exiled. But by the time World War II engulfed Europe, the chateau had long lost its grandeur. The Nazis, who occupied France during the war, saw the estate as more than just a relic of France's past. It became a strategic military command post for German officers who used its secluded location as a base for planning military operations. The chateau's walls, once filled with laughter and luxury, now echoed with the sounds of war. Yet, those who were stationed at the chateau began to speak of something else: strange happenings that could not be explained by the presence of soldiers or wartime stress. The chateau had a dark history, and some believed that Napoleon himself still lingered within its halls. But after the German occupation, the stories took on a new, more sinister tone. It wasn't just Napoleon's ghost that haunted the chateau anymore. Something far more disturbing had awakened in the years of war. In the summer of 1941, a high-ranking German officer named Major Heinrich Kessler was assigned to the Château de Malmaison as part of the Nazi command post. Kessler, a practical man with little patience for superstition, was focused solely on the logistics of the war effort. The chateau, with its high walls and secluded location, seemed the perfect place for strategic planning. However, from the moment Kessler arrived, he couldn't shake a feeling of unease. The chateau, though beautiful, was cold and lifeless, and its long history seemed to weigh heavily on the air. At night, the corridors were dimly lit, and the silence of the estate was oppressive. Kessler dismissed the strange sensations at first, attributing them to the stress of his duties, but soon he began to experience things that could not be easily explained. It started with small, unsettling incidents. Late one night, as Kessler worked alone in his office, he heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps in the hallway outside his door. They were slow and deliberate, as if someone were pacing back and forth just beyond the threshold. Thinking it was one of his men, Kessler called out, but no one answered. The footsteps continued for several minutes before stopping abruptly. When Kessler opened the door to investigate, the hallway was empty. Over the following weeks, the incidents became more frequent and more disturbing. Doors would slam shut on their own, even when there was no breeze to explain it. Lights flickered at odd intervals, plunging the chateau's grand rooms into darkness without warning. And more than once, Kessler awoke in the middle of the night to the sound of whispering low, indistinct voices that seemed to come from the walls themselves. Kessler tried to dismiss the occurrences as the result of war nerves, but deep down he couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. The chateau was haunted, he was certain of it, and the presence he felt within its walls was not just that of Napoleon's ghost. It was something older, darker, and far more dangerous. One evening, Kessler was invited to dinner in one of the chateau's grand dining rooms, a space that had once been filled with the laughter and conversation of France's elite. Now, the long, elegant table was set for only a handful of officers, and the room's high ceilings and ornate chandeliers only served to amplify the sense of emptiness. The dinner began as usual, with formal conversations about strategy and military logistics. But as the meal progressed, Kessler found his attention drawn to the large, gilded mirror that hung on the far wall. The mirror, a relic from Napoleon's time, was an imposing piece, tall and wide, its edges decorated with intricate carvings of laurel wreaths and eagles. At first, Kessler couldn't explain why he felt so uneasy about the mirror. There was nothing particularly unusual about it, yet every time he glanced at it, a sense of dread settled over him. The room around him seemed to blur, and the figures of his fellow officers faded into the background. All Kessler could see was the mirror and the faint shadow that flickered within it. The shadow was tall and indistinct, its outline barely visible against the glass. It seemed to shift and move, as though something or someone was standing just out of sight, watching the dinner unfold. Kessler's breath caught in his throat as the shadow began to take shape. It was a figure, dressed in the uniform of a Napoleonic soldier, his face obscured by the darkened glass. The figure stood perfectly still, yet Kessler could feel its eyes on him, cold and piercing. Without thinking, Kessler stood up abruptly, knocking over his chair in the process. The other officers stared at him in confusion, but Kessler couldn't tear his eyes away from the mirror. The shadowy figure remained, unmoving, watching him with a silent intensity. "Major Kessler?" one of the officers asked, his voice breaking the tense silence. "Are you all right?" Kessler blinked, and in that instant, the figure in the mirror was gone. The reflection returned to normal, showing only the officers seated around the table. Shaken, Kessler quickly excused himself from the dinner, but the image of the shadowy figure in the mirror stayed with him, haunting his thoughts long after he left the room. The stories of Napoleon's ghost had circulated for years, long before the Germans occupied the chateau. Soldiers and visitors alike claimed to have seen the former emperor wandering the halls, his hands clasped behind his back as he paced the grand corridors. Some said he appeared as he had in life, dressed in his military uniform, while others described him as a pale, ghostly figure, his face lined with the wariness of defeat. Kessler had always dismissed these tales as fanciful legends, the product of overactive imaginations. But after his experience with the shadow in the mirror, he began to wonder if there was more truth to the stories than he had initially believed. One night, as he lay in bed, struggling to fall asleep, Kessler heard a sound that sent a shiver down his spine, the faint rhythmic tapping of boots against the stone floor of the hallway. The footsteps were slow and measured, the unmistakable cadence of a military man. Kessler sat up, his heart pounding in his chest. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they stopped just outside his door. For a long moment there was silence, and then the door creaked open, as though pushed by an unseen hand. Standing in the doorway was a figure dressed in the unmistakable uniform of Napoleon Bonaparte. The figure was tall and imposing, his face hidden in shadow. Kessler's breath caught in his throat as the figure took a step forward, his dark eyes locking onto Kessler's with an intensity that chilled him to the bone. "Leave this place," the figure said, his voice low and commanding. "This chateau is not yours, it belongs to the past." Kessler couldn't speak. His body was frozen in place, his mind racing with fear and confusion. The figure took another step forward, and as he did, the air in the room grew colder, the temperature dropping rapidly. "Leave," the figure repeated, his voice now a growl, "or suffer the consequences." With that, the figure vanished, leaving Kessler alone in the darkened room, his heart pounding in his chest. After the encounter with Napoleon's ghost, Kessler became obsessed with the idea that the chateau was haunted. He began to research its history, delving into old records and archives in an attempt to understand the strange occurrences. What he found only deepened his sense of dread. The Château de Malmaison had long been rumored to be cursed. Even before Napoleon's time, the land on which the chateau was built had been the site of violence and bloodshed. Centuries earlier, during the medieval period, the land had been the scene of a brutal massacre, and it was said that the souls of the slain still wandered the grounds, seeking vengeance. But there was something even darker lurking within the chateau, something that predated both Napoleon and the medieval massacre. According to local legend, the chateau had been built on a site of ancient pagan rituals where blood sacrifices had been made to appease malevolent spirits. The land itself was cursed, and anyone who dared to build on it would suffer the consequences. As Kessler dug deeper into the chateau's past, he began to experience even more terrifying phenomena. The whispers that had once been faint and distant now followed him everywhere, growing louder and more insistent. He could no longer sleep through the night without waking to the sound of footsteps pacing outside his door, or the feeling of cold hands brushing against his skin. One night, Kessler awoke to the sound of something scraping against the walls. He sat up in bed, his heart racing, and listened. The sound was faint at first, like nails dragging across stone, but it grew louder, more aggressive, as though something or someone was trying to claw its way into the room. Kessler jumped out of bed and rushed to the door, but before he could reach it, the temperature in the room plummeted. His breath hung in the air in visible puffs, and a deep guttural growl echoed through the room. It was then that he saw it, the shadowy figure from the mirror, standing in the corner of the room. Its form was more distinct now, and Kessler could see that it wasn't Napoleon. This figure was taller, darker, its eyes glowing with a malevolent light. It was a presence far older and far more dangerous than anything Kessler had encountered before. The figure moved closer, its footsteps slow and deliberate as the growl grew louder. Kessler backed away, his body trembling with fear, but there was nowhere to run. The figure reached out a hand, its fingers long and clawed, and as it did, the room seemed to close in on Kessler, the walls pressing in from all sides. The last thing Kessler saw before everything went black was the figure's glowing eyes, burning with hatred. In 1944, as the war turned against the Germans, the chateau was abandoned by the Nazi forces. Major Heinrich Kessler, along with the other officers stationed there, left the estate behind, but the hauntings had left a permanent mark on him. He was never the same after his time at the Château de Malmaison, and he refused to speak of the events that had occurred within its walls. After the war, the chateau was restored to its former glory, but the stories of ghostly encounters persisted. Visitors to the estate often reported strange occurrences, doors slamming shut on their own, cold spots in the hallways, and the eerie feeling of being watched by unseen eyes. Some claimed to see the ghost of Napoleon himself, still pacing the grand corridors, his hands clasped behind his back as he surveyed his former home. Others spoke of darker, more malevolent spirits, shadowy figures that moved through the chateau at night, their eyes glowing with a sinister light. The estate's dark history, combined with the trauma of war, seemed to have left a permanent scar on the chateau, a place where the past and the present collided in eerie and unsettling ways. In the years following the war, the Château de Malmaison became a popular tourist destination, drawing visitors from around the world who were eager to learn about its rich history. But for those who believed in the supernatural, the chateau was more than just a historical landmark. It was a place where the spirits of the past still lingered, trapped in the walls of the grand estate. The stories of ghostly encounters continued to grow, with some visitors claiming to have seen the figure of Napoleon standing in the chateau's grand hall, his expression solemn as he gazed out over the estate. Others spoke of strange noises in the night, footsteps, whispers, and the distant sound of boots marching down the long, empty corridors. But the most chilling reports came from those who claimed to have encountered the darker presence that haunted the chateau. Visitors spoke of shadowy figures lurking in the corners of rooms, their eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. Some described a feeling of being watched, followed by a cold, oppressive sensation that left them breathless and terrified. The chateau had become a place where the lines between the living and the dead blurred, and for those who ventured too far into its dark history, the consequences could be deadly. The Château de Malmaison, once the seat of Napoleon's power, has become a place where the past refuses to die. The spirits of the dead, from the soldiers who occupied the chateau during World War II to the figures from Napoleon's time, still roam its halls, trapped in an endless cycle of haunting and unrest. For those who visit the chateau today, the echoes of history are never far away. The grand estate, with its opulent rooms and sprawling gardens, may seem peaceful at first glance, but beneath the surface, the spirits of the past linger, waiting to be seen, felt, and heard. The Château de Malmaison is more than just a historical landmark. It is a place where the ghosts of France's past still walk, their presence a reminder that some spirits are never truly at rest. Story 3, The Battle of the Bulge, Belgium, frozen in time. The Ardennes forest in Belgium is a vast, dense wilderness, filled with thick trees, deep ravines, and narrow roads. It was here in December 1944 that one of the largest and deadliest battles of World War II took place, the Battle of the Bulge. Hitler's desperate attempt to break through the Allied lines and divide their forces caught the Americans by surprise. In the freezing cold of the Belgian winter, the Germans launched a massive counteroffensive, creating a deadly bulge in the Allied front line. The fighting was brutal. Soldiers endured freezing temperatures, lack of supplies, and relentless artillery fire. Over the course of 6 weeks, tens of thousands of men lost their lives, and entire villages were reduced to rubble. The battle left a permanent scar on the land, and those who fought there never forgot the horrors they witnessed. Today, the Ardennes forest is peaceful, its trees standing tall and silent, as if guarding the memories of the past. But for those who visit, especially during the cold winter months, the battle is not forgotten. Many claim that the spirits of the soldiers who died in the frozen forests still roam the land, trapped in time, forever reliving the last moments of their lives. It was December, nearly 70 years after the Battle of the Bulge, when a group of historians and enthusiasts made their way to the Ardennes for an expedition. Among them was Paul, a historian who had spent much of his career studying the battle. He had come to the forest with a singular goal: to retrace the steps of the American 101st Airborne Division, which had played a crucial role in the defense of Bastogne. Paul had heard the stories of the hauntings, the whispers of ghostly soldiers wandering the woods, the strange noises in the night, but he didn't believe them. As a man of reason, he was focused on the facts of the war, not the supernatural. But as the group ventured deeper into the forest, something strange began to happen. The first night, as they set up camp near the ruins of an old village that had been destroyed during the battle, Paul heard the faint sound of gunfire. It was distant, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable, the rapid bursts of machine gun fire, followed by the crack of rifles. He paused, his hand on the strap of his bag, listening carefully. But the night was still, and the others in the group seemed unfazed. Paul shook his head, convincing himself that his mind was playing tricks on him. The Ardennes had been a battlefield after all, and it was easy to imagine the sounds of war lingering in the air. But as the night wore on, the sounds became harder to ignore. The wind picked up, rustling the branches of the trees, and with it came the unmistakable echoes of men's voices, low and urgent, as if giving commands in the heat of battle. Paul sat up in his tent, his heart racing as the sounds grew louder, the crack of gunfire ringing through the forest. It wasn't until he stepped outside, the cold air biting at his skin, that he saw them faint figures moving through the trees, their forms barely visible in the moonlight. The figures were dressed in the uniforms of American soldiers, their helmets low over their faces, their rifles held at the ready. They moved in a slow, methodical pattern, as though advancing on an unseen enemy. Paul watched in stunned silence as the ghostly soldiers made their way through the trees, their forms flickering in and out of existence. The forest was deathly silent, save for the occasional rustle of the wind through the branches. Paul's breath caught in his throat as he realized what he was seeing. These were not reenactors, nor were they living soldiers. They were phantoms, ghosts of the men who had fought and died in the Battle of the Bulge. Paul's mind raced as he tried to make sense of what he was witnessing. The soldiers seemed unaware of his presence, their focus entirely on the battle unfolding around them. One of them crouched behind a tree, his rifle raised, while another motioned for his comrades to move forward. Paul took a step closer, his heart pounding in his chest. He could see the fear and determination etched on the faces of the soldiers, their eyes wide with terror. They were young, no older than 18 or 19, most of them, and their uniforms were tattered and stained with mud. One soldier had a bandage wrapped around his head, and blood seeped through the fabric. As Paul watched, one of the soldiers broke from the group and began running through the trees, his boots crunching in the snow. He stumbled, his rifle slipping from his grasp, and he collapsed to the ground, clutching his side. Paul's instinct was to rush to the soldier's aid, but he knew it was impossible. These men were already dead, had been for decades, and there was nothing he could do to save them. The scene played out in eerie silence, the soldiers continuing their ghostly march through the forest, their faces pale and gaunt, as though they had been frozen in time. Paul could only watch as the phantoms disappeared into the trees, leaving him alone in the cold, dark woods. The following morning, Paul told the others in the group what he had seen, but they were skeptical. Some laughed it off, while others suggested that Paul had been imagining things. But Paul knew what he had seen. It was too real to be a trick of the light or a product of his imagination. Determined to find answers, Paul decided to return to the spot where he had seen the ghostly soldiers. This time, he went alone, carrying only a flashlight and his notebook. As he made his way through the snow-covered forest, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The wind howled through the trees, carrying with it the faint sound of voices, men shouting orders, the distant boom of artillery fire. Paul's breath came in short, visible puffs as the cold settled into his bones. The forest seemed to close in around him, the trees pressing closer together, their branches casting long, dark shadows across the ground. And then he saw them again. The soldiers appeared out of the mist, their forms flickering in the dim light of the setting sun. They moved in the same slow, methodical way, as though trapped in an endless loop, forever reliving the last moments of their lives. Paul watched in silence as the soldiers marched past him, their faces expressionless, their eyes hollow. One of them turned his head, his gaze locking onto Paul's for just a moment. The soldier's face was pale, his skin stretched thin over his bones, and his eyes were dark, empty voids. For a brief second, Paul felt as though the soldier was trying to communicate with him, to reach out from beyond the grave. But before he could say anything, the soldier turned away, disappearing into the trees with the rest of the phantoms. Paul stood frozen in place, his heart racing. The forest around him was silent once more, but the memory of the ghostly soldiers lingered in his mind, haunting him. As Paul delved deeper into the history of the Battle of the Bulge, he learned of a small Belgian village called Foy, which had been at the center of some of the fiercest fighting. Foy, located near Bastogne, had been occupied by German forces before the 101st Airborne Division launched a desperate assault to retake it. The battle was brutal, with heavy losses on both sides, and the village was reduced to rubble. Today, Foy is a quiet, unassuming village, its buildings rebuilt and its streets peaceful. But beneath the surface, the scars of the war remain. The villagers speak in hushed tones of the ghosts that haunt the fields and forests around Foy, phantoms of the soldiers who fought and died there, their spirits unable to find peace. Paul decided to visit Foy, hoping to uncover more about the hauntings. As he walked through the village, he couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. The air was heavy with the weight of history, and the silence of the village was almost oppressive. That night, Paul set out for the nearby woods, where the heaviest fighting had taken place. The snow crunched beneath his boots as he made his way through the trees, the cold biting at his skin. The moon was high in the sky, casting a pale, eerie light over the landscape. As Paul reached a clearing, he heard the unmistakable sound of artillery fire, followed by the deafening crack of machine guns. He froze, his heart pounding in his chest. The sounds were distant but clear, as though a battle were raging just beyond the trees. Paul's breath came in short, panicked gasps as the sounds grew louder, closer. He could hear the shouts of men, the rapid bursts of gunfire, the dull thud of explosions. And then, out of the darkness, they came. A group of soldiers, American and German, staggered into the clearing, their faces twisted with fear and pain. They were locked in battle, their rifles raised, their movements frantic. Paul watched in horror as one of the American soldiers was struck by a bullet, his body jerking violently before collapsing to the ground. The scene played out in agonizing detail, the soldiers fighting and dying before Paul's eyes. But as he watched, he realized something horrifying. The battle was silent. Despite the gunfire, the explosions, the shouts of the soldiers, there was no sound. The entire scene unfolded in eerie, ghostly silence, as though the men were trapped in some terrible, frozen moment in time. The following morning, Paul returned to the village, shaken by what he had witnessed. He spoke with the local villagers, hoping to find someone who could explain the strange occurrences in the woods. One of the older villagers, a man named Gene, told Paul a chilling story that had been passed down through generations. During the Battle of the Bulge, the village of Foy had been surrounded by thick forests, and it was in these woods that some of the bloodiest fighting had taken place. The soldiers who fought there were subjected to relentless artillery barrages, their bodies torn apart by explosions and gunfire. Many of them had died in the trees, their bodies left to freeze in the snow. According to Gene, the trees in the forest had absorbed the screams of the dying soldiers, and on cold winter nights, when the wind blew through the branches, you could still hear their cries. The locals called it the screaming trees. Paul decided to return to the woods that evening, determined to uncover the truth. As he walked through the forest, the wind picked up, rustling the branches above him. At first, it sounded like the normal creaking of trees in the wind, but then Paul heard it, a low, guttural moan, like the sound of a man in agony. He stopped in his tracks, his heart pounding. The sound grew louder, more distinct, until it was no longer just a moan, but a chorus of voices, screams, cries for help, the desperate pleas of dying men. Paul's hands trembled as he fumbled for his flashlight, shining it into the trees. The wind whipped through the branches, carrying with it the tortured voices of the soldiers who had perished there. The sound was deafening, a cacophony of pain and suffering that seemed to echo through the very fabric of the forest. Paul clamped his hands over his ears, but it was no use. The screams pierced through the silence, growing louder and more intense with each passing second. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the wind died down and the forest fell silent once more. Paul left the Ardennes with a newfound respect for the power of history. The Battle of the Bulge had left more than just physical scars on the land. It had imprinted itself on the very soul of the forest, trapping the spirits of the soldiers who had fought and died there. The ghostly soldiers, the echoes of battle, the screaming trees, they were all reminders that the past was never truly gone. The Ardennes forest had become a place where time stood still, where the spirits of the dead continued to march through the trees, locked in an endless cycle of war. For those who visit the Ardennes today, especially in the dead of winter, the echoes of the Battle of the Bulge are never far away. The forest, with its towering trees and snow-covered ground, is a silent witness to the horrors of war, and the ghosts of the soldiers who fought there still walk among the living, their footsteps frozen in time. The Battle of the Bulge, one of the most brutal and devastating conflicts of World War II, left an indelible mark on the Ardennes forest. The soldiers who fought and died there, their bodies buried in the snow and their souls trapped in the frozen landscape, continue to haunt the woods, their spirits reliving the horrors of war. The Ardennes may be peaceful now, but beneath the surface, the memories of battle still linger. The ghostly soldiers, the phantom gunfire, the screaming trees, all are reminders that the past is never truly at rest. For those who venture into the forest, especially on cold winter nights, the echoes of the Battle of the Bulge are impossible to ignore. The spirits of the soldiers, trapped in time, continue to march through the snow-covered woods, their voices carried on the wind, forever frozen in the moment of their death. Story 4. The Haunted Coast of Operation Dynamo, Dover Harbor, United Kingdom. The windswept cliffs of Dover Harbor stand as silent sentinels over one of the most critical moments of World War II, Operation Dynamo, better known as the evacuation of Dunkirk. In May 1940, as German forces swept through France, over 330,000 Allied troops found themselves trapped on the beaches of Dunkirk. In what would become a miraculous and heroic effort, British ships of all sizes, from military destroyers to civilian fishing boats, crossed the English Channel to rescue the stranded soldiers and bring them back to safety. Dover Harbor was the heart of this operation, its docks and piers bustling with activity as ships set sail for Dunkirk and returned, laden with exhausted soldiers. But for every soldier rescued, there were many who never made it back. Thousands died in the icy waters of the Channel, their bodies lost to the depths, their final cries drowned out by the roar of battle. Today, Dover Harbor is a place of remembrance, a historical landmark that commemorates the bravery and sacrifice of those involved in Operation Dynamo. But it is also a place where the past refuses to stay buried. Locals and visitors alike have reported strange sightings along the harbor, ghostly ships emerging from the mist, disembodied voices echoing across the water, and the faint, mournful cries of men who never made it home. In the years following the war, rumors of hauntings began to circulate around Dover Harbor. Fishermen returning from night trips spoke of strange occurrences, unexplained lights flickering on the horizon, the sound of foghorns when no ships were in sight, and most chilling of all, the appearance of ghostly ships emerging from the mist. One such sighting occurred in the summer of 1957. A local fisherman named Thomas Parker had spent most of his life working in the harbor, and he knew the waters of the Channel as well as anyone. He had always scoffed at the stories of ghost ships, dismissing them as nothing more than old sailors' tales. But that night, as he sailed his small fishing boat back to the harbor, he experienced something he would never forget. The evening had been calm, the sea unusually still, with only a light fog rolling in from the horizon. As Thomas navigated toward the harbor's mouth, he noticed a shadow in the mist ahead, a large, dark shape that seemed to be drifting aimlessly in the water. Thomas squinted, his hand tightening on the wheel as he tried to make out the details of the vessel. It was an old ship, much larger than his own, with weathered wooden planks and tattered sails that flapped weakly in the breeze. The ship was completely silent, and there were no signs of life on board. His heart raced as the ghostly ship glided closer, its form becoming clearer through the fog. Thomas realized with a shock that the ship was from another era. Its design was unmistakably that of a military vessel from World War II. Panic gripped him as he watched the ship approach, its hull looming over his small boat. He called out, but there was no response, only the eerie creak of the ship's rigging as it drifted past him. As the ghostly ship disappeared into the mist, Thomas felt a cold chill run down his spine. He had seen something impossible, something that should not exist. When he returned to shore, he recounted his experience to his fellow fishermen, but most of them dismissed his story as a trick of the fog. Yet Thomas knew what he had seen: a phantom ship, forever lost at sea, sailing the waters of Dover Harbor in search of the soldiers it had left behind. Dover Harbor is not just a place of ships and docks, it is also a graveyard. Thousands of soldiers and sailors perished in the waters during the Dunkirk evacuation, their bodies swallowed by the cold, unforgiving sea. Their souls, some say, still linger in the depths, unable to find peace. In 1962, a young couple named Alice and George Shaw visited Dover for a weekend getaway. They had heard about the harbor's history and decided to take a stroll along the pier one evening, just as the sun began to set. The harbor was quiet, the water calm, and the air thick with the scent of salt. As they walked along the pier, Alice heard something that made her stop in her tracks. It was faint at first, barely audible above the sound of the waves lapping against the rocks, but it was unmistakable, a voice calling out from the water. "Help me." Alice's heart skipped a beat, and she turned to George. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice trembling. George frowned, shaking his head. "Hear what?" "That voice," Alice insisted. "Someone's calling for help." George strained his ears, but the harbor was silent. He laughed nervously, trying to brush off Alice's concerns. "It's just the wind, love. There's no one out there." But Alice wasn't convinced. She leaned over the edge of the pier, peering into the dark waters below. For a moment, all she could see was her reflection on the surface, rippling gently in the twilight. But then she saw a pale face staring up at her from beneath the waves. The face was gaunt, its eyes wide and empty, its mouth open in a silent scream. Alice gasped, stumbling back from the edge, her heart racing in terror. George grabbed her arm, his expression full of concern. "What is it?" he asked, his voice urgent. Alice could barely speak. There's someone in the water," she whispered. "He's drowning." George rushed to the edge of the pier and looked down, but there was nothing there, only the dark, cold waters of the harbor. Alice never forgot what she saw that night. The image of the drowned man's face haunted her dreams for years, and she became convinced that Dover Harbor was haunted by the souls of those who had perished during the war. The cries for help, she believed, were the voices of the dead soldiers and sailors who had drowned in the channel, their bodies lost to the sea, their spirits forever trapped beneath the waves. In 1974, a British naval officer named Captain James Miller was stationed at Dover Harbor, overseeing a routine patrol of the channel. The night was calm, with only a light breeze blowing in from the sea, and visibility was good. As his ship cut through the water, Captain Miller spotted something unusual on the radar, a group of vessels, moving in formation several miles off the coast. Puzzled, Captain Miller ordered his crew to investigate. The vessels were not listed on any official manifest, and there had been no reports of any convoys passing through the area that night. As the ship approached the location of the radar blips, Miller's confusion turned to alarm. There, on the horizon, was a convoy of ships, large military vessels from the World War II era, their decks empty, their lights flickering weakly in the darkness. The ships moved in perfect formation, cutting through the water silently, as if on a mission that had been forgotten by time. Captain Miller's crew exchanged nervous glances as they watched the phantom convoy pass by. The ships were old, their hulls rusted and battered by decades of wear, but there was something deeply unsettling about them. They looked as though they had been pulled straight out of the past, untouched by the passage of time. Miller grabbed his binoculars and scanned the ships more closely. There were no crew members on board, no signs of life at all. The decks were empty, and the only sound was the faint creak of the ship's rigging as they sailed through the night. For a moment, Captain Miller considered ordering his ship to follow the convoy, but something stopped him, a deep, instinctual fear that told him these ships were not of this world. They were ghosts, relics of a long-dead war, and following them would mean crossing a line that should never be crossed. As the convoy disappeared into the mist, Miller lowered his binoculars, his heart heavy with the weight of what he had just witnessed. He knew without a doubt that he had seen a fleet of ghost ships' vessels lost to the war, forever sailing the waters of the Channel, their crews long dead, their mission forgotten. The white cliffs of Dover, towering over the harbor, have long been a symbol of hope and resilience for the British people, but they have also borne witness to countless tragedies. During Operation Dynamo, the cliffs stood as silent guardians over the ships sailing to and from Dunkirk, their chalky faces watching as soldiers were ferried across the channel to safety or to their deaths. In 1985, a group of hikers decided to explore the cliffs, hoping to catch a glimpse of the famous view of the harbor below. As they walked along the edge, admiring the rugged beauty of the landscape, one of the hikers, a man named Richard, noticed something strange. There, in the distance, perched on the edge of the cliffs, was a lone figure. The man was dressed in an old military uniform, his head bowed as he stared out over the sea. His posture was tense, as though he were waiting for something or someone. Richard called out to the figure, but there was no response. The man remained still, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Curious, Richard and his friends made their way closer to the figure, but as they approached, the man seemed to vanish into thin air. One moment he was there, and the next, he was gone, leaving only the sound of the wind howling through the cliffs. Shaken, the hikers returned to the village below, where they recounted their experience to a local historian. The historian listened carefully, nodding as they described the mysterious figure on the cliffs. "It's not the first time someone's seen him," the historian said quietly. "They say he's a soldier from Dunkirk, one of the ones who never made it back. He stands on the cliffs, watching for the ships that will never come." Richard and his friends left Dover with a newfound respect for the harbor's history and the ghosts that still linger there. The cliffs, they realized, were more than just a natural landmark. They were a place of memory, where the spirits of the past still stood vigil over the sea. Dover Harbor is a place of history, but it is also a place of ghosts. The waters of the channel, once filled with the ships of Operation Dynamo, now hold the spirits of those who perished during the evacuation. Visitors to the harbor often speak of strange occurrences, ghostly ships appearing in the mist, the faint sound of men calling for help, and the eerie feeling of being watched by unseen eyes. One of the most chilling reports came in 1998 when a tourist named Margaret Davies visited Dover with her family. They had come to see the famous White Cliffs and to learn about the harbor's role in the war. But what started as a simple sightseeing trip soon turned into something far more unsettling. As Margaret and her family stood on the edge of the pier, admiring the view, she noticed something strange in the water below a faint, glowing light, moving just beneath the surface. At first, she thought it was a reflection from a passing ship, but there were no other vessels in sight. The light grew brighter, and as Margaret watched, she realized with horror that it was not just a light, it was the outline of a ship, a large military vessel, its hull glowing with an otherworldly light. The ship was submerged just beneath the surface of the water, as though it had sunk long ago but was now rising from the depths. Margaret gasped, grabbing her husband's arm. "Do you see that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Her husband frowned, squinting at the water. "See what? That ship? It's right there." But her husband saw nothing. The ghostly ship was visible only to Margaret, its glowing outline moving slowly beneath the waves. As she watched in stunned silence, the ship disappeared into the depths once more, leaving the water calm and undisturbed. Margaret never forgot what she had seen that day. She became convinced that the harbor was haunted by the ships of Operation Dynamo vessels that had sunk during the evacuation, their crews lost to the sea, their spirits still trapped beneath the waves. The hauntings of Dover Harbor have become part of its legend. The ghost ships, the cries of the drowned, the spirits of soldiers standing vigil on the cliffs, all are reminders of the harbor's dark past and the sacrifices made during the war. For those who visit Dover today, the harbor is a place of memory, where the echoes of Operation Dynamo can still be heard in the wind and the waves. The fishermen who sail from Dover speak of ghostly lights on the horizon, ships that appear and disappear without a trace. The locals who walk along the pier at night often hear the faint sounds of men calling for help, their voices carried on the breeze. And the White Cliffs, towering above the harbor, remain a place of solemn remembrance, where the spirits of the past stand watch over the sea. Dover Harbor is a place where history and the supernatural collide, where the spirits of those who fought and died during the war still linger, waiting for the ships that will never return. Dover Harbor, with its rich history and deep connection to Operation Dynamo, is more than just a landmark. It is a place haunted by the ghosts of the past soldiers, sailors, and civilians who perished during the war, their spirits forever tied to the waters of the English Channel. The ghost ships that sail through the mist, the cries of the drowned, and the spirits standing on the cliffs are all reminders that the past is never truly gone. Dover Harbor is a place where time seems to stand still, where the echoes of World War II can still be heard, and where the ghosts of those who gave their lives for freedom continue to watch over the sea. For those who visit Dover Harbor today, the hauntings serve as a reminder of the sacrifices made during Operation Dynamo and the men who never made it back. The harbor is a place of both beauty and sorrow, a place where the spirits of the past stand vigil over the present, forever watching, forever waiting. Story 5. The Solomon Islands, Echoes of the Pacific Theater. The Solomon Islands, a remote chain of islands in the South Pacific, became a fierce battleground during World War II. In 1942, the Allies and Japanese forces clashed in a brutal and prolonged series of battles for control of the islands, the most famous of which was the Battle of Guadalcanal. These islands, once isolated paradises of lush jungles and pristine beaches, became littered with the remains of ships, planes, and thousands of soldiers who perished in the dense foliage or in the treacherous waters off the coast. The jungles of the Solomon Islands have long held a reputation for their mysticism and deep spiritual connection to the ancestors. For centuries, The local inhabitants believed that the spirits of the dead could walk among the living, particularly in places of great trauma. After the war, many villagers and soldiers alike began to speak of the restless spirits of those who had fallen, still wandering the jungles, beaches, and waters of the islands. Today, the Solomon Islands may appear to be a tropical paradise, but beneath its beauty lies a haunted past. Fishermen, locals, and visitors all tell stories of strange sights and sounds, of ghostly soldiers, phantom planes, and eerie whispers carried on the wind. The echoes of war still resonate throughout the islands, and those who venture too deep into the jungle or too far out to sea may find themselves encountering more than just the remnants of history. It was 1956, more than a decade after the end of World War II, when a group of Australian researchers visited Guadalcanal to study the impact of the war on the island's ecosystem. The group, led by a young scientist named Dr. Owen Matthews, set up camp near the site of what had once been Henderson Field, the airfield that had been the focus of much of the fighting during the Guadalcanal campaign. The researchers were there to observe the regrowth of the jungle and to collect data on how the environment had recovered from the scars of war. But it didn't take long for strange occurrences to disrupt their work. On the second night, as the team sat around a campfire discussing the day's findings, they heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps coming from the jungle. The footsteps were heavy and deliberate, as if a group of men were marching in formation. The researchers fell silent, listening intently. The sound grew louder, closer, but the darkness beyond the fire's glow remained impenetrable. Dr. Matthews stood up, peering into the jungle with a mixture of curiosity and concern. "Who's out there?" he called, his voice echoing through the trees. There was no response, only the rhythmic sound of boots crunching on the underbrush. The team exchanged nervous glances. They had been told that the island was mostly uninhabited, save for a few small villages scattered along the coast. There were no military patrols, no reason for anyone to be marching through the jungle at this hour. As the footsteps drew nearer, Dr. Matthews grabbed his flashlight and shone it toward the sound. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the thick foliage. But there was nothing there, no soldiers, no patrol, just the empty jungle, silent and still. The footsteps stopped. For a moment the team stood frozen, their hearts pounding in their chests. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the sound resumed this time, moving away from the camp, deeper into the jungle. The researchers were shaken, but they tried to brush it off as the sounds of animals or the wind playing tricks on their ears. Yet as the days went on, the strange occurrences continued. The footsteps became a nightly ritual, always approaching, then retreating, as if a ghostly patrol of soldiers was still marching through the jungle, unaware that the war had ended long ago. As the days passed, the researchers began to explore more of the island, venturing deeper into the jungle where some of the fiercest fighting had taken place during the war. They found rusted weapons, decaying helmets, and the remains of tanks half buried in the undergrowth, all reminders of the brutal conflict that had raged here. One afternoon, while trekking through the jungle, Dr. Matthews and his team stumbled upon an overgrown clearing. In the center of the clearing stood the skeletal remains of what had once been a Japanese outpost. The jungle had reclaimed much of the structure, vines twisting around the crumbling walls and trees growing up through the floor. As they explored the abandoned outpost, one of the researchers, a woman named Claire, noticed something strange. The air in the clearing was unnaturally cold, a sharp contrast to the oppressive heat of the surrounding jungle. The rest of the team felt it too, a sudden drop in temperature that made the hair on the back of their necks stand on end. Claire shivered, rubbing her arms as she walked toward the center of the outpost. There, half buried in the dirt, was a rusted metal plaque with Japanese writing etched into it. She knelt down to brush away the dirt, but as she did, she heard a low whisper of voice, speaking in Japanese, though the words were too faint to understand. She froze, her hand hovering above the plaque. The whispering grew louder, and more voices joined in, overlapping and indistinct, as if a crowd of people were speaking just out of sight. "Do you hear that?" Claire whispered, her voice trembling. The rest of the team nodded, their eyes wide with fear. The voices seemed to be coming from all around them, echoing through the trees, growing louder with each passing second. Dr. Matthews stood at the edge of the clearing, his heart pounding in his chest. "We need to leave," he said, his voice tense. "Now." The team hurriedly gathered their equipment and made their way back through the jungle, the eerie whispers following them all the way to the safety of their camp. That night, none of them could sleep. The sounds of the jungle had taken on a sinister quality. The rustling of leaves, the distant calls of birds, all seemed to carry the weight of something unseen, something watching. Word of the strange occurrences on Guadalcanal spread, and over the years, more and more visitors to the island began to report their own encounters with the supernatural. Local villagers spoke of ghostly soldiers seen wandering the jungle at night, their forms flickering in and out of existence like shadows in the moonlight. Some claimed to have seen the spirits of both American and Japanese soldiers, locked in an eternal battle, their voices rising in anger and fear as they relived the final moments of their lives. One of the most chilling stories came from a local fisherman named Tavi, who had grown up hearing the tales of the haunted jungles. In 1969, Tavi was out fishing with his uncle just off the coast of Guadalcanal when they encountered something that would change their lives forever. It was late in the evening, the sun dipping below the horizon, casting the water in shades of gold and purple. Tavi and his uncle had been fishing for hours when they noticed a strange light in the distance, glowing faintly just beneath the surface of the water. At first, they thought it was the reflection of the moon, but as the light grew brighter, they realized it was something else entirely. The glow took on the shape of a ship, a large military vessel, its hull ghostly and translucent, its deck empty and abandoned. Tavi's uncle, a superstitious man, immediately recognized the ship as one of the many that had sunk during the naval battles of World War II. He urged Tavi to turn the boat around and leave the area, but Tavi was transfixed by the sight. The ghostly ship seemed to rise from the depths, its outline shimmering in the water, as if it were trying to break free from the ocean's grasp. As they watched, the sound of distant gunfire echoed across the water, followed by the faint, ghostly cries of men shouting orders. Tavi's blood ran cold as he realized what he was hearing, echoes of the naval battles that had taken place off the coast of Guadalcanal so many years ago. Without a word, Tavi turned the boat around and sped back to shore, the eerie glow of the ghost ship fading into the distance behind them. From that day on, Tavi refused to fish in that part of the ocean, convinced that the waters off Guadalcanal were haunted by the spirits of the sailors who had perished there. The waters surrounding the Solomon Islands are filled with the wreckage of ships and planes that were destroyed during the fierce naval and aerial battles of World War II. The wrecks lie at the bottom of the ocean, their rusting hulks serving as underwater tombs for the sailors and pilots who went down with them. In 1983, a group of divers from New Zealand visited the Solomon Islands to explore some of the sunken warships. The team, led by an experienced diver named Simon Daniels, was eager to document the wrecks and uncover the stories of the men who had fought and died in the Pacific. Their first dive was to the wreck of the USS Quincy, an American heavy cruiser that had been sunk during the Battle of Savo Island in 1942. The ship lay on the ocean floor, its once mighty guns now covered in coral, its decks littered with the remnants of the battle. As the divers descended into the depths, Simon felt an overwhelming sense of awe. The wreck was both beautiful and haunting, a silent monument to the men who had lost their lives in the war. But as they swam closer to the ship, something strange began to happen. The water around them grew colder, and the sunlight filtering down from the surface seemed to dim. Simon's heart raced as he glanced at his dive computer, which showed that the temperature was dropping rapidly, far more than it should have at that depth. The rest of the team noticed it too. One of the divers, a man named Jack, gestured toward the ship's bow, his eyes wide with fear. Simon followed his gaze and saw it a figure standing on the deck of the sunken ship. At first, Simon thought it was another diver, but as they swam closer, he realized with a shock that the figure was dressed in an old military uniform. The man stood perfectly still, his face obscured by the shadows, his posture rigid as though he were standing at attention. Simon's breath caught in his throat as the figure slowly turned to face them. The man's face was pale and gaunt, his eyes hollow and empty. For a brief moment, their eyes met, and Simon felt a cold wave of fear wash over him. The figure raised his hand in a slow, deliberate salute, and then, in the blink of an eye, he was gone, disappearing into the darkness of the ocean. Shaken, the divers quickly ascended to the surface, their hearts racing. When they returned to the boat, they spoke in hushed voices, unsure of what they had just witnessed. But one thing was certain: the wreck of the USS Quincy was not just a grave, it was a haunted battlefield, where the spirits of the sailors still stood watch over their ship. One of the most famous battles of the Solomon Islands campaign was the relentless air war between the Allies and the Japanese. The skies over the islands were filled with the roar of planes, the crack of anti-aircraft fire, and the screams of engines in freefall as pilots engaged in deadly dogfights above the jungle. In 1992, a small group of aviation enthusiasts visited Guadalcanal to explore the remnants of the air war. They had heard stories of ghost planes, phantom aircraft that still flew the skies long after the war had ended, and they were eager to uncover the truth. On their third night, as they camped near the remains of Henderson Field, the group experienced something that defied explanation. It was just after midnight when the first sound reached them, the low, unmistakable hum of a propeller engine. The group exchanged puzzled glances, knowing that no planes were scheduled to fly over the island at that time of night. As the sound grew louder, they stepped outside their tents and looked up at the sky. There, silhouetted against the moon, was the outline of a fighter plane, a World War II-era aircraft, its wings glinting in the pale light. The plane flew low, its engine roaring as it passed overhead. The group watched in stunned silence as it banked sharply and disappeared behind the trees. But there was no sound of an impact, no explosion, no sign that the plane had crashed. It was as if the plane had simply vanished into thin air. Over the next hour, the sound of the phantom plane returned several times, each time growing more distant, until finally it faded into the night, leaving the group with the chilling realization that they had just witnessed a ghostly air raid, a final mission flown by a pilot who had never made it home. The Solomon Islands, with their lush jungles and crystal-clear waters, may seem like paradise, but for those who know their history, they are a place of ghosts. The battles fought here during World War II left an indelible mark on the land and sea, and the spirits of the soldiers, sailors, and pilots who died in the Pacific Theater still haunt the islands. Fishermen continue to report sightings of ghost ships drifting through the mist, their decks empty, their hulls glowing with an eerie light. Local villagers speak of strange lights in the jungle, the sound of distant gunfire, and the occasional sighting of ghostly soldiers marching through the trees. For those who visit the Solomon Islands today, the echoes of the past are never far away. The spirits of the dead, trapped in the places where they fell, continue to walk the land and sail the seas, forever bound to the islands that claimed their lives. The Solomon Islands, once the scene of some of the most intense fighting in the Pacific Theater, are now a place of beauty and mystery. But beneath the surface, the ghosts of the past linger. The soldiers who died in the jungles, the sailors who went down with their ships, and the pilots who never returned from their final missions still haunt the islands, their spirits trapped in the moments of their deaths. For those who visit the Solomon Islands, the echoes of World War II are impossible to ignore. The islands are haunted by the memories of war, and the spirits of the dead continue to make their presence known, reminding the living that the past is never truly gone. The Solomon Islands may be a paradise, but they are also a place of restless spirits, ghosts, who will never leave, forever bound to the islands where they lost their lives. These haunted WWII battlefields serve as reminders of the immense sacrifices made during the war, but they also suggest that some spirits have never truly left. Whether you believe in ghosts or not, visiting these sites is a chilling experience, where the past seems to echo just beneath the surface, waiting to be heard.